Hello and welcome back, macroeconomic students. We are starting Unit 4, and we're going to be talking about money and the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve System. Let's get started. Yes, that's me, and that is not real gold. If it were, I wouldn't be doing this. Okay, so why do we use money? Real quick, we basically have, or we used a barter system before that. Goods and services are traded directly. There's no money exchanged. However, we found over time that the exchange of money makes for an easier transition, and we'll talk a little bit about those. I'll talk about problem number 2. Some goods cannot be split. So if one cow is worth 100 bottles of beer, how do you exchange if you only want 2 bottles of beer? Because you can't chop up your cow. I mean, you can, but you're going to have to make sure that you sell all of that cow rather quickly, especially in the days before refrigeration. So what is money? Well, it's anything that's accepted for payment of goods and services. There is such thing as commodity money, so that's anything that performs the function of money. Cigarettes, gold, silver, ramen noodles, which has taken in the prison system. It is the number one currency right now. Yeah, it took over cigarettes about a year ago, I think. So that's how that works. And then you have what we call a fiat money, which is what we use in our money system. And that's something that serves as money but has no other important use. So, for example, coins and paper money, it's just the representation of money or some type of purchasing power to buy goods and services, but it really has no other use other than that. So the functions of money, first of all, a medium of exchange. Right, money can easily be used to buy goods and services. There's no complications. It's right. A unit of account. Money measures the value of all goods and services, so it acts as a measurement of value. So, for example, in our earlier example, 1 cow equals 100 beers. If we say 1 cow equals $100, right, we can then assess that 1 beer equals $1. And then a store of value, right? Money allows you to store purchasing power for later. All right, you can't do that with your cow. Your cow is only going to live a certain amount of time, and you have to take care of it and all of those things. So, yeah. Okay, there are 3 types of money. We're only going to talk about 2 types of money, right? So we're going to talk about what we call M1 and M2. There is an M3. We're not going to go that far. It's more than what our purposes need. So M1 is basically what we would consider the money supply, right? And we'll talk about this money supply in a little bit. And then banks kind of, I don't want to say hide their money or anything like that, but money starts to get tied up into accounts that aren't as easily accessible to people. And so money becomes harder and harder to retrieve when we get into like M2 type money and then M3 type money. So M1 is basically high liquidity. Liquidity just means cash. How liquid are your assets? All right. So for example, I have my iPhone. I could liquidize that pretty quickly. I have bonds and things like that, depending on the type of bond and those types of things, or equities. You can liquidize those relatively quickly. There are some things that you can really liquidize, but we say M1 is already liquid. It is cash. M2 is M1 plus saving deposits or money market accounts, time deposits, certificates of deposit, mutual funds, equity, things that take a little bit longer or are tied up into other investment vehicles that take a little bit of time to get to. They're not as liquid as just, cash sitting in a bank. All right, we're going to look at the money market today, and this is going to kind of be the big part of our intro to money and the demand for money and the supply of money. So the money market is the supply and demand for money. So businesses and people demand money. The Federal Reserve the Treasury supply the money, right? So we don't supply the money. We'll talk about other markets where we can supply money or currency. But in this model, it is consumers and businesses demanding money. And you'll notice that the supply of money here is a vertical line. So we have our downward sloping. This is very familiar to us, right? We have a negative relationship here and an inverse relationship here between the demand quantity of money and our interest rates. I always tell students that the interest rate is basically the price of borrowing money to buy things, right? If the price to borrow money is high, then you're not going to borrow money. If the price to borrow money is low, you're more likely to go, borrow money to buy a car or buy a home or go to school, et cetera, et cetera. Same for businesses, right? If the interest rate is low, businesses have an incentive to invest their money in investment spending, right? If investment or interest rates are high, right, people are going to hold on to their money and earn investment interest. And then the supply of money is vertical because there's only one amount of money that can be in the system at any given time. There isn't a certain amount of money that can be in depending on what people's demand and quantity demanded are and those types of things. So the supply of money, what the Federal Reserve says we want to have out in society, is vertical. It's stationary. Well, stationary for our purposes, right? So what backs the money supply, right? The money supply or money that you have in your pocket or in your wallet, good for you. I don't have that much in there right now. It's just an IOU from the government, right? It's backed by the government. It's not backed by gold or anything like that. It's the United States government says we back this. We say it's worth $1, so it's $1. One, it's accepted. You go into a store and you give somebody dollar bills, they will take it, right? It's scarce. You can't easily reproduce it. That's a good thing, right? And it's divisible, it's portable, right? Money can it can be transported, it can be divided, it can be stored, it can do all those types of things, right? The purchasing power of money is the amount of goods and services any unit of money can buy, right? And that's going to fluctuate, right? We already talked a little bit about inflation in our previous videos. And so inflation will affect the purchasing power of money. The demand for money. At any given time, a certain amount of liquid assets, or M1, is needed for purchases. The demand for money shows an inverse relationship between nominal interest rates and the quantity of money demanded. So again, it's not the demand for money, it's the quantity demanded for money at a particular price, or in this case, in our model, the interest rate. So if interest rates increased, what would happen to the quantity demanded for money? Well, quantity demanded falls because individuals would prefer to have interest earning assets instead. So they're going to make investment income. They're going to save their money. What happens to the quantity demanded when interest rates decrease? Well, when interest rates decrease, the quantity demanded increases. There's no incentive to convert the cash into interest earning assets, right? So people are going to go buy stuff, right? Consumer spending or investment spending, right? Businesses are going to invest if the interest rates decrease. Here's our demand for money, right? So it shows an inverse relationship between interest rates and the quantity of money demanded. What happens if the price level increases? Well, the demand for money would increase, not the quantity demanded, but the actual demand. Now, remember, we're talking about at the same. Let's imagine at 5%. What would happen if the price level increases at the same interest rate? Well, at the same interest rate, right, people are going to demand more money because they got to go pay more for stuff, right? So there are shifters, right? And I always talk about money pit, right? We're going to talk about price level, we'll talk about income, and we'll talk about taxation, right? So this easy way to remember it is a money pit, P-I-T, price level, income, taxation. that affect investment or consumer spending. So changes in the price level. If the price level increases, right, demand is going to increase. Changes in income, right? If your income increases, right, you're going to demand more money to go buy things. Changes in taxation. If taxes decrease, right, that's going to increase your demand for money because we have this wealth effect, right? You have this idea that your income is increased. And so investment and consumer spending would increase and the demand for money would increase. And vice versa in all of those cases, right? If the price level were to decrease, or if income were to decrease, or if taxation were to increase, right, demand would decrease. The supply of money, right? The supply of money is set by the Board of Governors at the Federal Reserve System, okay? And we will talk a lot about this in future videos because this will be monetary policy, right? And we'll talk about the differences between monetary and fiscal policy. So the Fed Reserve, right, is a nonpartisan government office, right? It sets and adjusts the money supply to adjust the economy, right? The Federal Reserve has certain mandates. One of their main mandates are to keep unemployment low and to keep inflation stable, right? To keep prices stable, by keeping inflation to a minimum. That's their main mandate by Congress. So those are the two main things that they're doing. And of course, they want to promote economic growth and those types of things as well. And this is called monetary policy. Monetary policy is the fact that they increase or decrease or shift the money supply left or right. There are the 12 different districts of the Federal Reserve. So the Fed adjusts the money supply to achieve macroeconomic goals, right? Remember those macroeconomic goals were to, right, promote growth, right, to limit unemployment, and to keep prices stable. That's their main thing, right? Just like fiscal policy is supposed to be doing, right? So let's see how the Federal Reserve does this. So we're going to take we're going to look at this Keynesian three-step transmission process here, and we're going to very basically look at how does the Federal Reserve affect aggregate demand. So we're going to tie this model to the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model, and we're going to affect aggregate demand. How can we get aggregate demand to increase? Or how can we get aggregate demand to decrease based on interest rates? And how does the Federal Reserve affect interest rates? The Federal Reserve doesn't just come out and state, okay, the new interest rate is this, right? And then everybody just has to make that the interest rate. They don't do that. They come up with what they would like the interest rate to be, right? They have some kind of target rate that they're looking for, and we'll also talk about an actual target rate. And they come out and they use their, they have three ways to shift this money supply. We'll talk about that in a future video. And they try to either increase or decrease interest rates by increasing or decreasing the money supply. So let's take a look at how this works, all right? So if the Fed increases the money supply, a temporary surplus of money will occur at 5% interest. This surplus will cause the interest rate to fall to 2%, okay? How does that affect aggregate demand? Okay, well, let's take a look at this. Increased money supply. You'll notice over here that this increase caused the interest rate to go down, right? Remember, we'll talk about the purchasing of bonds and the selling of bonds. We'll talk about liquid assets in banks, and we'll talk about, right, banks are competing against one another for people to borrow money. And so just like with anything, I tell students, imagine this isn't money. Imagine that the Federal Reserve wants to increase or decrease the price for Snickers bars, right? And they control how many Snickers bars can go into society at any given time, right? If you want to decrease the price of a Snickers bar, you flood the market with Snickers bars, right? And as convenience stores and grocery stores compete against one another, they'll lower their prices, right? We know that an increase in a supply would decrease the price. In this case, an increase in supply would decrease the interest rate, right? Because banks are competing against one another and thrifts and all those other things going on in the economy. The interest rates decrease. Okay, so increase decreases rates. That decrease in rate increases investment spending. It also increases consumer spending. And if you have an increase in investment spending or consumer spending, you have an increase in aggregate demand. And aggregate demand shifts to the right. We'll look at this more in future videos as well. Decrease the money supply. All right, and this is going to have the opposite effect. So you decrease the money supply. Decreasing the money supply, right, makes money harder to get, which increases the rate, right? We're only going to look at people who are going to borrow money and those types of things that are really, it's worth it to them to borrow money at, let's say, 10%, 12, 15%, whatever. This is going to decrease investment and consumer spending, and it will decrease aggregate demand. Okay, so let's take a look at all the things we talked about today. We talked about what money is and its functions. We talked about why money is effective. We talked about the two types of money, M1 and M2. We talked about the demand for money and the shifters for the demand for money. And we talked about how the supply and demand for money affect the interest rate. It is important that you understand that it is a supply and demand issue that affects price, and it is a supply and demand issue that affects interest rates. People don't just come out and say this is the price or this is the interest rate. It is a supply and demand determinant, right? The price is fixed or created by the availability and the want and willingness of people to go out and get it. Okay? And that creates the price or the price to borrow, also known as an interest rate. Until next time.